Right now, there's an upper level low located in the Gulf of Mexico that could potentially become Tropical Storm Arlene and bring major impacts along the Florida coast. Taking a look at the current water vapor imagery, we do see that this upper level low is currently meandering over the same area right now. For the most part, it's not moving very fast. Steering currents are very weak surrounding this upper level low, since we do have a blocking pattern that's building just to the north of it with two big ridges pretty much stationed over the same area, keeping the jet stream from being able to steer it out into the open Atlantic. So it's going to move very slowly over the next several days, but should gradually move eastward as a result of a low pressure system that's going to be located over northern Atlantic, and it could potentially enter conditions that could be conducive enough for tropical cyclone development once it approaches the Florida coast. As of right now, regarding the conditions surrounding this upper level low, we do see that the wind shear is still quite strong, which is very typical since we're not even in the hurricane season yet. The wind shear is still quite strong, as we clearly see that based on how far east the clouds are drifting, as there isn't really much thunderstorm activity either surrounding this upper level low. But eventually we're going to begin to see more convection along the surface for this to transition from an upper level low to more of a surface low pressure system, and we do have quite a bit of dry air that's entering the west side of this upper level low. And while dry air will likely stay with the storm throughout its time moving eastward, there still could be enough convection just to the northeast of this storm for it to develop a consolidated center of circulation to potentially develop into tropical cyclone. So here's the current probability that the National Hurricane Center is giving this tropical disturbance in developing, and we do see that for the next 48 hours it has a very low 10% chance of developing, while through the next 7 days it has a slightly higher chance, but still overall a low chance of developing into a tropical cyclone at 20%. However, this forecast is definitely subject to change, because now up until 7 days, that's still a lot of time for the computer models to really iron out their forecast. So the chance could certainly rise, or could certainly lower to almost or to a 0% chance. We're going to need to wait and see how the computer models detect this storm system as it continues ahead further eastward, and see how the overall health of this storm system will be by the time it approaches the coast of Florida. And we won't really know until, I'll say, the Friday timeframe, once it's just off the coast. But regardless of whether this develops into a tropical cyclone or not, Florida should expect heavy rain and potentially gusty winds associated with this tropical disturbance. Taking a look at what the computer models are forecasting at this time, the European model has been the computer model that's more lenient on developing a tropical storm just off the Florida coast. So this is how the European model forecasted the radar to look right now. We do see some thunderstorm activity right over the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, and a small surface low just off the Carolinas. Now moving forward beyond this point, we're going to see that this upper level low, like I said, will stay over the same area for several days. There's going to be a very weak steering flow, and pretty much the main catalyst that's going to force this low pressure system to move further eastward will be the strong upper level winds, as well as this low that's expected to move southward into closer to the middle Atlantic, which will steer this upper level low further eastward. And the European model eventually expects this upper level low to gain just enough convection, especially along the surface, for this to be considered a surface low once this approaches Florida. And we do see a well-defined low pressure system by the time we approach the Thursday timeframe. And moving forward beyond this point, we see that the European model is expecting the pressure to drop down to low 1,000 millibars around this range, which could potentially be strong enough to be considered a tropical storm. But of course, it's not just the wind speed or the millibar pressure that's necessary for this to be considered a tropical cyclone. It needs a well-defined rotation, well-defined center of circulation, and what that is pretty much composed of is having nearly an equal amount of winds on all sides of the center of circulation, and at least a decent amount of convection, and at least a well-defined core for where the strongest winds will be located. The winds can't be so diverse well from the center of circulation. There needs to be at least some sort of composition, or at least consolidation of the thunderstorm activity, or at least the wind field for this to be considered a tropical cyclone. So even if the pressure does drop this low and the winds at least somewhere surrounding the storm system do become strong enough for this to be considered a tropical storm, it might not necessarily be considered a tropical storm because there might not be that very consolidated center of circulation. But this could certainly be a tropical storm. We're just going to need to wait and see how this storm will be composed by the time this approaches Florida. And we do see much of the rain is to the northeastern side, which is the reason why the National Hurricane Center doesn't have high confidence that this will develop into a tropical storm, mainly because this storm is so lopsided. There's a high amount of stability that's expected to exist just to the west of this storm system, which will definitely hinder the possibility of this developing and gaining just enough convection. And there's going to be a decent amount of wind shear as well, and it could be just enough to completely break apart, or at least make it difficult for the storm system to create a strong center of circulation, or very consolidated and organized center of circulation. So we're definitely going to need to keep in mind of those factors as we approach the Friday to Saturday time frame once this really approaches Florida. But Florida still needs to pay close attention to this, because even if this doesn't develop into a tropical storm, heavy rain is likely associated with this surface low as it approaches the coast, where we're going to see the rain stay over Florida for several days, even well before this storm system actually makes landfall. So make sure to keep that in mind all throughout southern and central Florida, that flooding is likely at least somewhere in Florida, and there could be that possibility of flash flooding as well. Now beyond Florida, once this storm moves just to the east of Florida, we do see that this storm does become quite a bit stronger than it ever was in the Gulf of Mexico. However, by this point, it'll be primarily due to baroclinic influences. The sea surface temperatures over this area are still below the 80-degree threshold, so it's definitely going to need some instability to really help strengthen this storm as it continues to head further northeastward. And another thing too is that it's going to be well off the coast of the United States, which is good news, but you still might want to pay close attention to the possibility of rip currents, because this low could combine with another low just north of this storm that could potentially create some problems, especially in eastern Canada, regarding strong winds, heavy rain, and potentially some a high risk of rip currents. So you want to at least be aware of that possibility up along the east coast, as we do see the storm strengthen quite a bit once it reaches the open Atlantic, but it's going to be well off the coast, so it won't be that much of a worry. Just make sure to watch out for rip currents up along the east coast. But for Florida, pay close attention to heavy rain and gusty winds, because whether this develops into a tropical cyclone or not, those impacts are likely. Here's the European model's relative humidity forecast regarding this storm system, and of course we do see a high amount of dry air just to the west side of this storm system, which will be one of the big factors that will be a big detriment to this storm in trying to develop into a tropical cyclone, is that there's just going to be so much stability on the eastern side, which will decrease the winds, and now of course decrease the amount of heat that this storm will produce for, and enough convection for this storm to be able to develop a well-defined center of circulation and to have winds strong on all sides of this low pressure system for this to be considered a tropical cyclone, as we do see much of the convection is to the northeast. So we're going to definitely need to see at least some convection be able to penetrate the western side, and maybe it could develop strong enough winds on the northeastern side for this to at least steer the winds onto the western and southern dry sides for this to be considered a tropical cyclone. But again, the chances of that happening are definitely less likely thanks to the amount of dry air which is likely to stay as this storm approaches Florida, and it's unlikely that we're going to see the computer models shift their forecast to where the western side of the storm system would experience a more humid and conducive environment for a well consolidated center circulation to develop. The GFS model is definitely a lot less confident in developing this storm system. If we were to continue to move forward, we do see that while the GFS model does expect the convection to meander over Florida for several days, bringing a heavy amount of rain, it doesn't expect the convection to really develop just enough of a well-defined low pressure system for this to have much of any chance of developing. And moving forward with the forecast, we see that the GFS model, by the time we approach the Friday to Saturday timeframe, which would be the theoretical landfall of this storm system if it were to develop into a tropical cyclone, we see that there's a lot less moisture than what the European model is forecasting, where we only see the lighter shades of green rather than the darker shades of green, and we still do see a high amount of dry air on the western side. So this definitely won't be enough convection to lower the pressure enough along the surface for the winds to increase and for there to be much of any chance of a tropical cyclone in the GFS's model scenario. We're definitely going to need to pay close attention to how much moisture this storm system will retain by the time it approaches the eastern Gulf of Mexico, because that will be key in determining the chance we're going to see a tropical cyclone. And that chance, while it's low right now, still certainly could increase if the National Hurricane Center and the computer models detect that there's going to be a little bit more moisture than anticipated by the time this low pressure system approaches western Florida. So we're definitely going to need to pay close attention to that over the next several days, and I'll keep you guys updated regarding any changes in the forecast. Now, moving beyond the point at which the storm moves into Florida, we do see that the GFS model also agrees that this low will eventually move into the open Atlantic and potentially strengthen a little bit more, and we could see a nor'easter out of this just off the northeast coast by the time we approach next week. But it's still very far out. There's still a lot of time to iron out the forecast, so I'll keep you guys updated once that forecast becomes more certain. Another reason why the GFS model is less confident in developing a tropical cyclone just off the Florida coast is that the GFS model is expecting slightly more wind shear to exist over Florida by the time we approach a Saturday timeframe, which would be the peak timeframe of when the storm would have its best shot at developing. So we do see the wind shear is quite strong, where the wind shear is rather moderate, and we do see that extend into further inland into Florida. So for the most part, during its trip on eastward, it's gonna experience at least some sort of wind shear. This won't be a lightly sheared environment at all as this approaches Florida, but if there's just enough of a small area where the wind shear will be very light, as we might see right here in Florida, then there could be that possibility that this could develop a more well-organized center of circulation for this to develop into a tropical cyclone. However, the slightly more wind shear that the GFS model is forecasting compared to the European model is the reason why the GFS model does not want to develop this storm system into a tropical storm. Let me show you guys the European model in comparison to really show you how much less how much less wind shear the European model is forecasting by the time we approach Saturday, which is a primary reason why the European model is more confident in developing this storm system. In the European model scenario, while the wind shear is very similar to the GFS model, we do see that this low pressure system is in an area where it's right over where it's right over that small patch where the wind shear is rather light and just light enough for the center of circulation to become well organized without the wind shear being a problem and it tearing the heat away as well as the air molecules away from the center of circulation. So this is able to develop a well consolidated heat engine for the potential of a tropical cyclone to be higher in the European model scenario. So we're definitely going to need to pay close attention to how the wind shear will build by the time we approach Friday into Saturday to really determine the chances that this develops into Tropical Storm Arlene. Another thing that's good to point out is the sea surface temperatures currently, and we do see that this upper level low might experience some problems regarding the sea surface temperatures because there is that small patch where the sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico drop below 80 degrees, and even in the areas where the sea surface temperatures are over 80 degrees, it's a very shallow area where the sea surface temperatures are over 80 degrees. And since this storm is expected to move very slowly, it won't have a lot of very warm water for this to work with, as a deep ocean ocean heat content is going to be fairly weak for the most part, which will be another hindrance of the storm as it moves eastward, which is also part of the reason why the National Hurricane Center isn't very confident in this developing, mainly because this isn't enough warm water for a high level of convection to develop. So it's definitely going to potentially need some baroclinic instability or baroclinic influences for this storm to strengthen as it approaches Florida. However, like I said, regardless of whether this develops into a tropical storm or not, Florida should expect a heavy amount of rain over the next 5 days, where you could experience anywhere from 3 to 4 inches of rain in southern Florida and portions of central Florida. So you definitely need to pay close attention to that and pay close attention to the possibility of flash flooding because this storm system will move very slowly as well. So here's my forecast regarding this disturbance that's located over the Gulf of Mexico. So the area of future concern should be right over this area and pretty much throughout the entirety of the state of Florida. For Florida, you should expect heavy rain and potentially gusty winds along the coast this weekend, whether this develops into a tropical storm or not. So make sure to watch out for that for your weekend plans, and make sure to watch out for that possibility of flooding as well. And remember, if you see a body of water, turn around, don't drown, because typically the body of water is a lot deeper than what you'd expect. So make sure to take the right precautions as this potential flood threat moves into Florida this weekend. But thank you guys for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more hurricane season content.